All right, I see that we are 20 past, which is exactly the time for us to start. I hope that you see my presentation, and I see that you do. In case of any issues, just ping me on the chat. We also have a technical person in the room. My name is Adam, and welcome to SQLDay 2021. I hope you are enjoying yourself. Today's session will be about Azure Logic Apps and Azure Data Factory, and we will compare them for data integration scenarios. Because of course, any kind of service in Azure can be used for multiple scenarios, and just data integrations, those ETLs, are just one of them. So I thought about making this session for a long time because it allows me just to, well, share my experiences mostly. Since this is not the LinkedIn, I will not spend a lot of time on myself, but give you a very brief introduction of who am I so that you know who's speaking to you guys. So my name is Adam. I work for Lingaro, which you can see is one of the sponsors. At Lingaro, I'm Azure Cloud Architect, and that's my primary job for 5 years now, or actually even 6 soon. Personally, I'm Microsoft Azure MVP. It's an award, by the way. I do not work for Microsoft, and I do not speak for Microsoft. In case you have any questions about after the session, feel free to ping me on this email. Or you can use this QR code here. You can scan it with your phone and it will open my LinkedIn profile in case you want to connect. I also run a blog where I probably very rarely write anything because mostly I actually switched 2 years ago and I run my own YouTube channel where I share things about Azure mostly. And I call it Azure for Everyone, so feel free to check it out. And that's pretty much about me. And this slide will be shown at the very end as well. So in case you want to reach me after the session, you will also have a session to connect after. The agenda for us is today very simple. And let me actually very, very briefly open my camera just so you can see who's talking to you. Hey, I'm Adam, and I'm very happy to be here today with you guys. And, well, that's me. I just wanted to wait for you. But we can go back to the presentation. Today we'll be talking about what is Azure Data Factory and Azure Logic Apps very, very briefly so that we are on the same page. And then we will talk about similarities between those two services, and I will talk why this session even is happening and where is the confusion coming from. Then I will talk about typical scenarios, and I have one demo that I hope is very relatable for our everyday work as a data engineers. And I will be throughout this session talking about my experiences with those services and the reasons where I like to use Data Factory and scenarios where I prefer to use Logic Apps, or maybe even different tool, maybe neither of those. Just to be sure that we understand each other what this session is about, is this a guide? Well, it's not an ultimate guide for Logic Apps or Data Factory. It's not a one guide to always do the right choice, right? It's simply me sharing my experiences. So I will be talking where everything worked for me, where I was burned by using incorrect service for incorrect scenario. And hopefully this will give you a better overview of when to use which one. And unfortunately, well, I hope it will be not very difficult if you don't know any of those services. I designed the session in a way where you don't really have to know either Logic Apps or Data Factory. I have a fairly simplistic demo, no code. So most of the time you will be just seeing me click through Azure portal, but I do have a demo. So we start with Data Factory. If you go to Azure and you start reading the documentation, you will see that in the documentation, Microsoft says that Data Factory is a cloud data integration service. And they will tell you that you can run pipelines, you can design workflows, orchestrate data movement processes, and your business and implement your ETLs and ELTs in Azure, right? So that's the data service in the cloud to do data transformation. If you also learn Azure for the very first time, you will see that there's another service called Azure Logic Apps. Service might, for a person who's just starting, seem very similar because it's an enterprise integration service. And when you read through the documentation, again, you will see that, again, you design workflows, you can orchestrate tasks, you can design business processes, integrate applications, but they will also tell you that you can do data integrations here. Confusion will come here because, well, when someone learns both of those tools, very often they will find themselves in a position where they will check what certain tool A, in this case Data Factory, can do. They will see what Azure Logic Apps can do, and they will find that many scenarios can be implemented in both of them. So if both of those services can implement the scenario that you need, then when do you choose each one? And the problem arises even further when you start seeing how you implement stuff. In Data Factory, you create so-called pipelines. So you orchestrate tasks by designing blocks and just drag and drop arrows between them to ensure that the flow has a proper flow, right? This case, this is a very similar for those of you guys who are working with, for example, SQL Server integration services or Informatica. So you simply design data integration workflows in Data Factory. If you go to Logic Apps, you will see that the scenario is very similar because instead of calling them pipelines, we call them workflows. Instead of doing them horizontally, we do them vertically. But still, we use a visual interface and we implement workflows, and we can do data transformation. We can connect to multiple services at the same time. Not only when it comes to orchestration, both of those tools have rich integration capabilities. You can use conditions if you want. If you can very easily run parallel executions, so run multiple steps in parallel and combine the results. If you want, you can run loops. So all those tools allow you to do that. Again, another similarity. If you look at the connectors, connectors is simply a word that Microsoft uses if your tool, your service that you're currently using, can connect to an external service. For example, Data Factory can connect to over 80 services, right? So if you go to documentation and you start searching, for example, for some common database used on the market like SQL Server, Oracle, Snowflake, or maybe different clouds like Amazon, Google, etc., you'll find that connectors are most likely already there, right? There's over 80 connectors, so a lot of mainstream technologies are there. Connectors are also present in Logic Apps. In case of Logic Apps, we're talking about over 400 connectors. So in this case, you could think, well, I probably should use Logic Apps in case I want to connect to something else because it has more connectors. And most of the connectors available in Data Factory are available in Logic Apps as well. If we're talking about SQL Server, it's available in both. If we're talking about Oracle, again, available in both. That's the reason for this session, because many times I saw that if people were starting with their data engineering in Azure, they had trouble deciding when to use which one. And just because the tool, like for example, Logic Apps, allows you to do basic data transformation or even those advanced ones, doesn't necessarily mean that you should use Logic Apps for those data transformations. So here I am speaking to you mostly to show you a simple scenario where I will use either or both, and you will find that in just a minute, tell you about my experiences when I choose which one of those. For myself, let's talk about scenario. Prepared for you a scenario that I hope at least, if you guys are data engineers or data architects, that you will find somehow relatable. Because what's more relatable than you having users who have Excel files? We know users love Excel files and they love SharePoint. So I hope this is somehow relatable. So that's very often in my line of work is that users will have their Excel files. Typically, if they have, let's say, manual mappings that they need to do or some extra input that they want to provide for your data analytics solutions, most of the time they will ask if they can provide you in Excel. Most of the time they actually have a data in Excel already, and they collaborate using SharePoint. That's very, very often the scenario in many large enterprises, but also smaller companies. So what you will find yourself typically needing to do in Azure is that, okay, so they have Excel, they work on SharePoint, but I need it in my Azure SQL because I want to do some reporting, aggregations, maybe data transformations. So which service in Azure would you use to do that? You could use Azure Logic Apps, you could use Data Factory, you could use Azure Functions, Databricks, many different services. Today, if you would go to documentation, And I would say, by the way, what I'm saying is my typical workflow where I decide on the service. For me, Data Factory should be your primary choice when doing data orchestration in Azure. So in this case, notice that we want to move data. Then you should start searching through the documentation with Data Factory. You would find that Data Factory doesn't have a connector for SharePoint. Well, it does, but for SharePoint lists, but not SharePoint document libraries. It's not that easy to copy. It's not that easy to copy, a file. Then, if you don't have a connector in in Data Factory, try Logic Apps. And then you will find that Logic Apps have connector for SharePoint. So in this case, what I typically do is I create so-called landing zone. This landing zone for me would be either Azure Blob Storage or Azure Data Lake Storage. And I try to do as simple ingestion as possible. So not yet any kind of data transformation. In this case, Logic Apps have very nice connectors for both SharePoint and Azure Blob Storage. Therefore, I would use Azure Logic App to grab my files from SharePoint and copy them to Azure Data Lake. And then, since I have my data on Blob, which provides me a single place to load my data, I would use Azure Data Factory. You might think this is a complicated scenario, but this is exactly the demo that I will do in just a second. I will show you how to implement this scenario from end to end, and I will explain why I choose to use two services, even though Logic Apps have a connector for Azure SQL. So you could potentially just drag this line from Logic Apps directly to SQL, and this would work, except I wouldn't advise for it. And I will also talk about this basically from my personal experience. I will now move to Azure Portal, where what I prepared before this demo is a simple Azure Resource Group. Azure Resource Group is just a container for Azure services. So what I have already created, and just this is for the sake of the time, is I have Azure Data Factory created. It's currently empty. It's just created, and the connectivity is set up to this Azure SQL database and this Azure Blob Storage. So if you will look at our diagram, right, I have Azure Blob Storage created. I have Azure SQL created, Azure Data Factory. What I don't have is Azure Logic App, which I will create in just a second. Additionally, I have a SharePoint site, which is our Lingaro SharePoint site called Microsoft Competency Center, and a document library called Workshop Demo. So I will use this as an example of user uploading some data to SharePoint. So in our case, what we need to do first is to do this first step of the workflow, which is create Azure Logic App. In Azure, creation of Logic Apps is super straightforward. You simply select Add, select Marketplace, and type in the search Logic App. And you will find a blank template to create Azure Logic App. Select the resource group that we are currently working on. As I said, it's a container. Think of it like your personal place to create applications. And I will call this SQLDay sync SharePoint, right? So at least it sounds very natural to what we are trying to do. I will select a region. In this case, it's West Europe, mostly because my other resources are also in Azure West Europe Data Center. And that's it. You simply hit Create. You wait for the validation, and you hit Create. Right now, we created a blank Logic App, and within just like 10 seconds, this Logic App will finish creation. Because by default, Logic App does not create any infrastructure, and we're done. So now we have a blank Logic App. So this Logic App, as you see, the first thing that opens is a designer. This designer is basically giving you like a tutorial, right? Microsoft provides you with some Azure Logic App introduction, some brief information, some popular templates, so you can use something very commonly used. But we will start with a blank one, because I want to have a blank canvas to show you that even without those templates, it's very easy. Let me clear those recent, just to show you that this is how it looks if you didn't do anything. So we need to connect to SharePoint. Let's see how hard it is to connect from Azure Logic Apps to SharePoint. Simply type SharePoint, and a SharePoint connector will be found from the list of all available SharePoint connectors. There's a SharePoint here, and what we need to do is So let's do it like that. Whenever a user uploads or updates a file on our SharePoint site, we want to copy this to a blob. So what we will find is when a file is created or modified, this is a so-called trigger. A trigger is simply a definition of when to start our workflow. So we will start whenever there's a new or updated file on SharePoint. As you see, it asks me to sign into SharePoint, so I will sign in and use my personal account in this case. Notice that I'm using my personal account just for the demo purposes, because honestly, trust me when I say this, from the security perspective, never use your personal account to do this any kind of connectivity, because that connectivity is saved in Azure and anyone else can use it, right? So if you save your personal account, then anyone can impersonate you on SharePoint. So they could delete files or have access to confidential files because it's your account that is being saved. So create additional account that you can use for integration with SharePoint. Now we select a site. In this case, it's Microsoft Competency Center. Actually, let me zoom this in. And select the library. As I said, our library is called Workshop Demo, which we can see on this screen. So now, whenever there's a file uploaded on Microsoft Competency Center in a Workshop Demo library, we want to trigger this workflow. And how often do we want to check? Well, Logic Apps do not have event base, so they don't know. So what they will do, they will check every 3 minutes if there's a new file. For the purpose of the demo, I don't want to wait 3 minutes because our time is very valuable. So just for the demo purposes, I will check changing this time every 10 seconds, so that when I upload in just few seconds, our workflow will start. That's our first step. So we have an event. From this point, if the second step will run, that means there's a new file. So we need to do something. Because the first step says that, first step, notice that it says properties only. And this is a very good approach because it will give you information about the file, but not the content of the file. That's why we use another SharePoint step where we type get file content. So we want to get a file content, which is this connector here. Get file content needs also information. So from which side you are getting this file content? We are getting it from Microsoft Competency Center. And provide us a file identifier. So you need to grab the file and the identifier from the previous step. And you do it by simply, notice this. There's this box here which says file created or modified. So it provides you with the information from the previous step. Just scroll here and find identifier. Click on it and it will populate this box. So now the second step should run after there's a new file uploaded and the file will be grabbed. So what we want to do according to our diagram is put this file into Azure Data Lake. Also very easy. Just type blob, because in our case it's a blob storage. You will find the Azure Blob Storage connector. And what we want to do is create blob. Create blob will ask to create new connection. I will call this SQLDay blob. And allows me to pick a storage account that is available on my Azure subscription, so my blob storage, and hit create. Now I have connectivity created to Azure Blob Storage. So what I need in our blob storage, let me actually go back to our Azure environment. So let's go back to Azure portal. Let's navigate to our resource group that I created. And let's go to our Azure storage account. When I select it, I can go to containers. Containers is like a partitions. It's a place where you can put your files in. And I previously created one container called input. If I want, I can create more, but we will use this input container. And when I select it, you can see it's currently empty. So in our Logic app, we will select, using this pop-up here, select the input. So we will create new file in an input container. File name, what should be the file name? In my case, I will type file name here in the search, and I will find file name with extension coming from SharePoint. So I can name the file the same way it was named on a SharePoint. Here is a blob content. Blob content is from the previous step, which we see here, file content. That's pretty much it. Our Logic Apps literally has 3 steps. And we can verify if it works by simply going to our SharePoint site and dropping some file in. Let me use this data file here. I will open this Excel file very quickly to show you what we are working with. This Excel file is very simple. It has few tabs with some cars data, movies data, planes data, and persons data. So I'll use this persons tab, right? So this sheet with some planes table here. This is what I will want to load. First row is the one that I will be changing just to show you how it's updating. So let's close this and let's upload this SharePoint. In just a couple of seconds, you see file was uploaded. We know that Logic Apps checks every 10 seconds, so we can go back to our Logic App, select here, select run history. As you see, there are no runs still. But if we will keep refreshing, in about 10 seconds, as you see, a run just started. When you select this run, you will see it already finished. So we were able to grab the file. Let's see some information. You see who uploaded this. This would be my Azure trainee account, which I'm currently logged into. Workshop demo slash data XLSX, right? So that was the file that we uploaded. We can get the file content, and we can see the blob was created. And we can verify this here. Boom. We have now very easily integrated SharePoint with Azure Blob Storage using literally 3-step Logic App. And this is why I use Logic App for this kind of integration scenarios. That was very simple. And notice that purposely, I could potentially try this Excel file within Logic Apps. They have connectors to read Excel files. But trust me when I say this, you don't want to parse Excel files or actually do data transformation within Logic Apps. Try to keep them as simple as possible. If your Logic App has like 3 steps, that's probably perfect. If it has 5 or 10, perfect. So, yes, good question, Marcin, but I will probably leave the questions at the end. I will probably have a few minutes, but since I already saw that, yes, Logic App is basing on a SharePoint modified date and it's saving the previous successful run date, and that's why it knows if the file changed. So it will check that every 10 seconds. So right now, we have our file in SharePoint. So that means I can go back to my resource group. Let's go back here and open Data Factory. I can open Author and Monitor, which will open a similar visual designer, except for Azure Data Factory. This is where I can run my workflows. The one thing that I did before this, and mostly because, for the sake of time, I already created connectivity in Data Factory. So we can test this connectivity that I am connected to my blob storage. And I'm also connected to my Azure SQL database. Trust me when I say this takes about 2-3 minutes to set up. So you're not missing much. It's not really complicated process. But I wanted to avoid, in case some issues or I want to spend more time on Q&A rather than setting this up. Other than that, Data Factory is very empty right now. So let's create new pipeline. So in Azure, this is an equivalent of our Azure Logic App. One pipeline is one run. In this case, let's call this load Excel to SQL. Right, that's the name of our pipeline. We need to copy data. There's a step for that called copy data. We just drag and drop here, and we have a copy step. So let's copy data to SQL. Let's call it like that. 2 things that we need to do is define source and a sink. To do that, you can either do it from this panel on the left-hand side. It doesn't really matter. I will hide this panel mostly because they are not necessary right now. And I know that in Data Factory, you have a lot of those panels, which might tend to be confusing at first. So I select source here, and we define source. In this case, we want to define our blob storage. So we add new, and in here, new dataset definition. So we select Azure Blob Storage because that's the service that we're connecting to. We select continue, and we have the file format. So notice you have multiple formats supported by default, and Excel is one of those. Currently, at the time of this presentation, only reading from Excel files is supported. Writing to Excel files is not yet supported by Data Factory natively. So I will select Excel. I will hit continue. So I will call this planes cell DS. And I'll select a link service, which is my connectivity that I showed you a moment ago. So my connectivity details to my Azure Blob Storage. Next, I need to provide a file path. So where is my Excel located? As I showed you, it's in the container called input. And in there, we have our data XLSX. Of course, this is being hard-coded right now. If you are working with Data Factory more, you can very easily parameterize this to pass this information dynamically. But for the purposes of the demo, let's keep it simple. So we have data XLSX. If this Excel is properly formatted, you should be able to select the sheet name. Notice that it is. Therefore, we are able to select from cars, my planes, persons, and planes. So I will be using planes data. First row as headers, that's correct. If you remember my Excel file, let's open that very quickly just to be sure. My Excel file has, in fact, first row with header values. So let's keep it at that and select this first row as header. Import schema, sure, why not? And hit OK. This is properly configured. My first thing to tell you is that always verify. So the way you can verify this is by going to the dataset that was just created. And there's a preview data button here. Using this data, you can preview if the Excel is being parsed correctly. So when I click preview, in about a few seconds, as you see, perfect. We have proper headers, we have proper data. And again, we didn't really have to write a single line of code or anything for that. Now, we just need to do the same stuff except for our target place. In this case, our SQL database. So we need to select new sync. And actually, just for brevity, let's hide that. Let's select new sync, add a new sync. In this case, type in the search SQL, and you should find SQL database, right? Select next, and I will call this Azure SQL data source. Select the link service, so the connectivity details to my storage, and notice that there's no table right now in our database defined. So I will hard code the table. Again, this is something that you should not do in production use case, but it's very nice for the demo. So I will select planes, DBO, schema, planes, table. Do you want to import schema? Not necessarily, since there's no target table, there's nothing to import. And hit OK. Since their table, it doesn't exist on the table, if you would try to run it, there will be an error, right? There's nothing to insert to. But there's a checkbox here that you can select, auto create table. One thing to be aware of that is, again, my advice to you is always write the DDLs yourself. You don't want to have some implicit conversion happening on the way because Data Factory misjudged the data type. You always want to define the types in your SQL database, so always create the tables yourself using DDLs. For the demos or for some testing, auto create table feature is very nice. Or maybe in some rare scenarios where you need a dynamically created tables. So to verify if this works, we can hit debug, which allows us to test this run before publishing this. And while this runs, and it should run in about 10-15 seconds, I think, I will navigate back to my resource group. In my resource group, I will navigate to my SQL database, and I could right now open either Azure Data Studio or Azure SQL Management Studio, but I wanted to have this demo as simple as possible. Therefore, I use what is already given in Azure Portal. So in this case, I'll use Azure Query Editor, which allows me to connect to Azure SQL Database directly from Azure Portal and run some queries. So as you see, this is basically like a small, very, very simple data studio that you can run directly in the cloud. So if I go back to Data Factory, you will see this run finished in 8 seconds. And I can also verify that by expanding tables here. Boom, there's a planes table. I can select star from DBO planes and run it. And there's our data. So more or less, we did what we wanted to do. One additional thing that you might want to do is add here pre-copy script and type like truncate table DBO planes, because this is an insert, right? So it would delete. So you want to overwrite all data when there's a new data coming in. If we're happy with this, we can publish, and everything is ready to be used. If you want to do very last thing, right? Because right now we have two separate flows. If we look at our diagram, we have one flow where Logic App is copying data from SharePoint to Azure Blob Storage. And there's another flow which copies from Blob Storage to Azure SQL. But those are right now two separate flows. This is the first decision that you need to make as a data engineer. Sometimes you might want to do data factory on schedule, like once a day, because you don't want to run too many workflows if people are constantly editing the file. Maybe every 15 minutes, every half an hour, whatever you want, maybe not too often, right? Because you will pay for every data factory run. So in this case, that's it. What I like to do in this case, for this at least demo, let's say that we want to have this data in database as soon as possible, because this is a very critical application, and we want to reflect the data as soon as it's remotely possible. In this case, we can go back to our Logic App and notice how simple it will be to connect from Logic App to Data Factory. In this case, what we need to do is enable so-called identity. Identity is, think of it like that. It's a technical account for your Logic App. So if your Logic App want to connect to other services within Azure, you can enable identity, in which case there will be an account created that will be called like this Logic App. In this case, SQLDay, and I see I made a typo, sync SharePoint. So we need to go back to our Data Factory and grant this Logic App permissions to create new Data Factory runs. So we select Data Factory, we go to Access Control, we add a new role assignment. From the role, actually, this is one of the first ones. So Data Factory Contributor, this role, select the account, and we are selecting our Logic App. See, I enabled account, and I granted it Data Factory Contributor role on my Data Factory. Now this Logic App has permissions to start new Data Factory pipelines. So notice how simple it is to be leveraged in your workflow. If we go back to our our Logic App, to the editing, and select New Step, and now type Data Factory. Select our Data Factory, and there's a step called Create a Pipeline Run. We select that step, and it will ask, where do you connect? Well, I don't want to connect using my personal account. Here's connect using Manage Identity, which is this account that we just created. Call this ADF connection, create. Now, new connection was created. We select our subscription. This is where our Azure resources are tied. We need to provide the name of our resource group. Sorry, I'm jumping through the screens. So let me open another screen because I will need that. And our resource group name, you can find this here. This is the resource group name. So just copy to clipboard, paste it here. Okay. Data Factory name. You should see that from the dropdown automatically because you have permission granted. And Data Factory pipeline. Boom, there's the one that we just published. Load Excel to SQL and hit save. So if this works, and I'm pretty confident it should, my users right now can upload a new data to SharePoint whenever they want. Even more, I basically gave them a visual interface to edit their data for their reporting. They can open this data here, and it will open Excel Online. We all know Excel Online from our work. And they can change this demo to, let's say, demo 2.3 something, maybe change this to B123, and this Airbus to, I don't know, F777, whatever that maker would be, right? I can do that. And I don't even need to click Control S to save. It's already saved. I can go back to my SharePoint site and notice that modified was modified a few seconds ago. Talking for so long because this already is those 10 seconds. That means if nothing wrong happened, I can refresh my Logic App and we should see new run. Or not. Boom, there it is. It was there, I don't know what. Oh, sorry, I clicked something. Fresh. Oh, there's this. Running, right? It's currently running. If we select it, we can review. Oh, it's already finished. It took 5 seconds. So without actually diving into details here right now, let me just show you that in our DBO planes, if we select, boom, our data is there. And it was modified. We literally provided, not only within like 15 minutes, 20 minutes of coding, without any actual code, ability for our users to edit their manual mappings or provide us with some data. And within like half a minute, it's already in SQL so that your reporting tools can leverage this. Very nice. It's probably very relatable scenario, right? Who didn't hear that our users have data in SharePoint? So this brings me to our presentation. What is the perspective that we're doing here? And by the way, I will answer the questions after the presentation, so just stay with me. Of course, there are many perspectives here and many experiences. My experiences and my personal preferences are my own, but I feel like I like to share them, so maybe they will give you some ideas and allow you to build your own perspective. Today's presentation is from the data engineering perspective, right? So creating pipelines. For me, most of the time, it's very important to, understand what you want to do. So let's say my first thing that I do in most of my enterprise applications for my clients is grab the data and put everything first into landing zone. So do this like a very simple ingestion process. So if I have, let's say, on-premise Oracle database, what I will do, I will go to Docs. I will find that Data Factory can connect to on-premises. Data Factory can connect to Oracle by default. No extra setup is required other than setting up on-premise connectivity with, let's say, integration runtimes. Therefore, my choice would be to use Data Factory for that. As I said, this is the data integration service, therefore it should be your primary choice if you can use it. If I have some external service like SharePoint, in this case, I will use a Logic App like we've seen, right? Data Factory do not have connectors for SharePoint. It has for SharePoint lists, not for SharePoint files. And I will keep this Logic App as simple as possible because I very often want to source my data from my source only once. I don't want to keep repeating this in case this Logic App failed, right? If I would do data transformation, it's possible that something would fail. So I would need to reload and reload and reload. And sometimes data already changed because someone edited it. So I don't even have a chance to retry this error. If I have Amazon S3, so equivalent of Azure Blob Storage in Amazon, I will use Azure Data Factory because, again, there's a connector for that. That will be my first part of my ETL. I will ingest everything, put everything on Data Lake or on Blob Storage. Mostly, for me, it's Data Lake, by the way, these days. I use blob storage sometimes when I build, let's say, web applications, but mostly Data Lake for data engineering. So I have now everything in Data Lake. So if I need to do transformation, so for the second part of your ETL, the T, right, transform, I will use, if I want to load to SQL, of course, I will use Azure Data Factory. Again, it has native connectivity. It's very good at it. It's very performant at it. Not the most performant solution out there. There are more performant ones, like let's say native connectors used in Databricks might be faster, or in .NET. It will be much faster than ADF in this case, but it is pretty fast. If I need some advanced data transformation, I would do them neither in Logic Apps or Data Factory, like super advanced transformations, very complex ones. Probably need to revert back to code, like Databricks. Databricks allows you to write code using Python or Scala. And Python, we all know that Python is very, very popular right now. And you cannot achieve every single transformation in those tools. In Logic Apps, you don't want to because there are certain limitations. In Data Factory, also, those are visual tools. So they will never be as flexible as you wish because they don't have every single possible step out there thought through. That's a side note, right? It's not the topic for us today. Additionally, so if I load data, maybe I want to send an email. That's very often the case in our Data Factory pipelines, in our data engineering pipelines. What I will use? Logic App, of course. Logic Apps have native connectivity to many SMTPs or Exchange. I can very easily leverage Logic App within Data Factory to send an email. Also, for example, if I have Azure Analysis Services, which is quite often used for those larger Power BI reporting or Power BI Premium, I will again use Azure Logic App. So as you see, what's the key takeaway for me from this slide? When I move data and do data transformation, I really want to do them in Data Factory if it's supported. Not supported, if it's just a simple API integration like sending emails, SharePoint integration, analysis services model refreshes with their REST APIs, API connectivity or things like that, more complex ones that typically will revert back to a Logic App. And then if I do something super complex, I typically revert to something that I can write an actual code, like Databricks. Because in Databricks, I have full control over what I do. And most importantly, I don't have limitations like timeouts or things that appear in Data Factory. I don't know if you know, but both Logic App and both Data Factory have 1 minute connection timeout on web activities. That's a hard-coded limit. You cannot skip over it. So if you have external API that doesn't respond within 1 minute, or actually 2 minutes for Logic Apps, you will have an issue and you will not go over it. You will have to redesign your solution. That's the thing. So in general, just to summarize this, if we have a big volume but pretty low complexity, I use Data Factory. If I have low volume but higher complexity, I use Logic Apps. Notice that I wouldn't use Logic Apps for high volume stuff, because if you would deep dive into Logic Apps documentation, you would find they have a lot of hard limits. They, for instance, will have for example, I love that example because it's one of the first examples that people will find if they decide to use Logic Apps for data ETLs, for transformations. Logic Apps have connector to SQL. Why don't you use it? If you try to insert data to SQL or run an SQL procedure, there's a hard-coded 2-minute timeout. So if your stored procedure doesn't finish in 2 minutes, and most of the time we know that it won't, because if the data is larger and the procedure is more complex, it won't finish in 2 minutes. You'll get a timeout, and you will not go over that limit. That's why I'm saying it's for small volume tasks. In this case, like loading this file from SharePoint is a perfect example of that. It's a small file. We just want to copy this. We don't parse this Excel. We don't really do anything with data. We just integrate SharePoint with blob storage, and that's it. Keep it simple, really. That really goes a long way. If I want something very complex and high volume, the options that you have is either Data Factory Batch Connector, which I personally don't really use. It's an option that I wanted to mention just to be sure that we all know it's there. It allows you to write .NET code, which is one of the disadvantages. Many companies simply don't have enough .NET developers for that. And it's harder for your data engineers to support it. Many data engineers will know Scala or Spark or PySpark, but they will not know .NET. That's why most of the time I don't really use that. If you have high complexity stuff, I typically revert, and high volume stuff, I typically revert to Databricks and write some Python or Scala. Probably Python more often recently because it has better libraries for Excel and more people know Python on the market. Other options, well, you can use Logic Apps custom connectors. So write your own connector for Logic App if you want to, or use Azure Functions. A lot of possibilities, but I wanted to mention all those 4, like custom connectors, batch connectors, Databricks, and functions. Be sure to remember that in all of those cases, you already write code. And writing code is something as a data engineer you might want to avoid for smaller applications if you don't really have to. But if you know from the start the application is bigger, you might go into the route where you already use Data Factory just for orchestration, Logic Apps just to bring those data from external services or maybe output data to external services and integrate with other services, and then do all the data transformations directly in Databricks, or maybe Synapse Analytics, which is a new thing from Microsoft that also allows you to do pretty much the same thing. So what are the good things for Data Factory here? It's really good at moving small and very large data sets. And moving is the key part here, right? It's very good at moving data, just one-to-one movement or just narrowing down the columns. It's good for simple data transformation. I wouldn't say complex ones because it has those mapping data flows. Mapping data flows, by the way, an equivalent of Azure SQL Server integration runtime, more or less. They have limitations. There are certain steps that you can do. So it will scale, although you might find yourself in a place where you simply cannot do something in Data Factory if you try to do transformation there. Executing and waiting for long processes. Data Factory is very good at that. You can execute stored procedure and wait for it pretty much infinitely. Very good. What are the bad things about? Data Factory, trust me when I say this, is very bad at doing cross-API integrations. So if your client will tell you, I have my data in external REST API, please pull it from Data Factory, maybe you can do it. In some cases, you might. Is it advised? Probably not, because you might find yourself in a place where at a certain point you will hit a limit. Because of that limit, you will not be able to continue, and you will not jump over it, trust me. And suddenly you either will have half of your logic in Data Factory and half in Azure Function or other service. That's also very bad. For me, don't try to integrate APIs using Data Factory, especially because of this hard limit of 1 minute for the response from external service. Service integrations, as I said, you can potentially send an email from Data Factory using REST API and make Microsoft Graph API. It's just, there are so much easier ways. In Logic App, I would just click that in 2 minutes. In Data Factory, would spend probably half an hour at least researching how to do it, and then researching what is Graph API and how to use it, and then how to grant permissions. Oh, tricky stuff, trust me. And Data Factory is a little tricky when it comes to debugging and testing. So that's why doing those complex integrations and API integrations, Data Factory, are a little tricky. Just movement of the data and transformation of the data is fairly good. Those extra tasks, not necessarily. But Logic Apps in this case come with help. They allow you to integrate services very easily. They allow you, I typically say, treat Logic Apps as an extension of what Data Factory can do. If you're building pipelines and you need that extra functionality, use Logic Apps. They are good for very simple, very small jobs. They're perfect at it, trust me. Small jobs, really nice. Visual UI allows you to pretty much create any kind of task, any kind of pipeline. Because they are visual building blocks, but they allow you to pretty much write as a code, you can do very complex stuff in Logic Apps. I'm not sure if you want to, but you can. That's an option there. You cannot do this complex integrations in Data Factory. And right now, it's something very hot coming, is that if you will go to Azure Portal, if you go to Logic Apps, you will see that in our LAN history, you will see this information here. When you click on this, you will go to Microsoft documentation, which will tell you that there's currently a new overview for Azure Logic Apps. And what is awesome here is not only your Logic Apps will be able to be run locally, so you'll be able to develop locally on your own computer Logic Apps. They will also allow you to test it. There will be breakpoints, there will be debugging points. So you finally will be able to develop your Logic Apps just like you would be developing your REST APIs or your custom code. Bad things, Logic Apps has very short timeouts, very small limits. So for example, if you think, if this Excel file is 10 gigs, Logic App will not handle that. It will throw an error and you're good, you're done. If you want to run stored procedure over 2 minutes, not good at it. So Logic Apps, just because of their nature, their enterprise integration service, they're not data transformation service. They have those small limits just to ensure that people use them properly. They, are hard to maintain if you start overusing them. What I've seen is that when people start using Logic Apps, they're very quickly, very oftenly fall in love, let's say. They start using it left, right, here, there, and suddenly they end up with like an environment where they have 50 Logic Apps. Point is very hard to manage. You will expect very, very many integrations. Try different approach. Most of the time it will pay off, even if you will need to invest in some sort of coder in your team, like .NET developer or a Python developer, because it might be a little tricky to manage all of those, especially if we'll start calling each other. If they're very simple, if there's 40, maybe, but most of the time, don't overdo it. Just don't think of it. Logic App is not a hammer and everything is a nail, right? So just don't start using it for everything. And They're used for low volume stuff. So don't overuse them because Logic Apps are very expensive. Well, in comparison, very expensive. Let's say my Logic Apps right now that I created just during this demo would run for every 10 seconds. That would cost me 300 euros. If I would change this from every 10 seconds to every 3 minutes, which I advise you to do, of course, because we don't want too many runs anyway, or every 10 minutes, every 15, every hour, every 3 minutes would cost you only $7. And every $7 a month is super good price. So they might be expensive if you overuse them. Again, is this a guide? Not really. I'm just showing you my experiences. One additional thing that I want to show you, and we will have 5 minutes for question and answer, is that in my private subscription, I want to be sure that we understand one thing. I have two pipelines here. One is called, and I'll actually let me start both just to show you logs in that just a second. Run this one. And let's run this one. You can and you should still use Azure Data Factory web activities, which allow you to call REST APIs. Sometimes you can do very cool stuff very easily. For example, this is a small block with just one URL and nothing else. Notice that everything is pretty much empty. Will start my virtual machine, copy my data, and stop virtual machine. So we will literally save a lot of money. This is extremely cool setup if you're using, let's say, SQL Server Integration Runtime, because you can save a lot of money on Microsoft SQL Server licenses. In Azure, you pay for the licenses per hour, per second, right? So being able to start SQL Server, copy your data, or execute, here's the step. In general, so maybe like this, right? So execute SSIS package after starting the SSIS runtime, doing something like this, and then stopping it after the pipeline is finished. Perfect example, because you only will pay for, let's say, 1 hour of virtual machine instead of 24. Awesome stuff. And you can and you should integrate with external services from Data Factory if the call is super, super simple. If you want to do something complex, like refresh analysis services, my advice is use, let's say, a webhook within Data Factory, and then create a Logic App, which notice has several steps in this case. This Logic Apps refreshes analysis services for me. It has like take a request from Data Factory with some parameters, respond back to Data Factory that we've got this job and we're going on, create some variables, and then refresh analysis services using HTTP REST request and wait in the loop until the refresh of analysis services is done. And when the refresh is done, respond back to ADF. And this might look complicated, but it's super simple. Of course, it's super simple if you know Logic Apps. I don't assume it's super simple if someone didn't ever use them. And then you respond to ADF when it's finished. And in that also simplifies your Data Factory pipelines by leveraging Logic Apps, because implementing this in Data Factory is a chore. Trust me, it's super inefficient, and you additionally pay more money because it will cost you much more. This waiting time will cost you much more in Data Factory. Our pipeline is finished in the meantime as I was talking, and we can see our stop and start pipeline. We can select it, select Gantt chart, and we can see start time was running for about a minute, then our copy data finished in about 8 seconds, and then we stopped the virtual machine. That means our VM was running for about 10 seconds. We will literally pay for 10 seconds of this virtual machine. If it comes to the second run, refresh AAS, also finished. Copied data in 7 seconds, and then we refreshed analysis services in 2 minutes. So my big advice to you, those are my experiences. If you do something complex, don't do it in Data Factory. Extend their functionality with some Logic Apps. That's pretty much it. By the way, before we finish and before we go to Q&A, my ladies from our team, from HR team, just ask if you guys will have a chance to just go by there and go by our stand, talk to them if you want. If you want, you can leave CV, or there's some sort of prize with some competition right now going on. You can check that there as well if you want. That's just a quick note from me. For me, that's it. I will now move to those questions that we already had during the session. I will read them out loud and try to answer if I know. I will leave the slide for a couple of seconds in case you want to grab my email or see my blog, check my YouTube channel, or use this QR code to go to LinkedIn and connect with me. I'm happy to connect with you guys, and feel free to just hit me up with some questions. So let's see. We had two questions. One was from Marczak. What about Logic App versus ADF? In terms of performance, ADF can handle huge data sets. Is Logic App capable of handling that? I asked because I always thought that of Logic App of something similar to a small service-oriented architecture microservice component to handle small requests like for one client or whatever. Perfect. You pretty much summarized my few last slides. It is. Basically, Logic Apps are like creating a small microservices. The power of Logic App is those connectors, those 400 connectors. It's the power to give data engineer who not necessarily knows .NET or Java, or you don't want to maintain a code. You know, as soon as you introduce a code in your application, you have to maintain it. That means you probably should create DevOps. You probably should do documentation of that code. You need code reviews. You need to CI/CD deployment pipelines, unit testing. Ooh, a lot of stuff. Most data engineers don't want to do that. So Logic Apps give this way of being between creating microservices, and there's a way to create microservice with HTTP connectors there. But correct, they are very, very small tasks. I don't think you should use them as soon as the task is very big, and I don't advise you to try to parse any data and do any data transformation in Logic App. Keep them simple using this KISS rule, right? So keep it simple, silly. Pretty much that. Second question, and I hope I answered that one. If I didn't, ping me on the chat. Or you can, of course, raise your hand if you want to say that, but I will read the ones that are already in chat. How do you postpone the execution of Azure Data Factory? Logic App run every 10 seconds, but we want pipeline to run every 5 minutes. It's really simple. To be honest, you can probably run your Logic App every 5 minutes if that's what you want. If you want to still keep it, let's say, event-based, right? So run every time there's a new file. But if you don't want to do that, what you can do is unlink, right? So don't, sorry, that's not the window. What you can do is remove this step, save it, and then in Data Factory, sorry, where's the window? This one. You can simply add new trigger and select new trigger and create a scheduled trigger or a tumbling window with interval of every 5 minutes. And that's probably advised. I probably would do something like that because, you know, if you will have a lot of Excels, you don't want to run hundreds of pipelines all the time. You probably want to copy so-called sync every now and then do the pipeline. I hope I answered this one. How would you compare refreshing AES with Azure Automation plus PowerShell instead of Logic Apps? Honestly, perfect question. We all know whoever ever refreshed another services always did it with PowerShell because that was the standard on the market for many, many, many years since as analysis services was on-premise service. I would say I prefer REST API, not only because two things. Once I have this Logic App, notice this one, it's really codeless solution. Sorry, that's not the one. That's the one. Second of all, I have a parameters here, so I can reuse this Logic App across multiple analysis services. I can very easily, in my data factory, this one, pass this as parameters. Notice that there's a name of analysis services, region, name of the model, and some parameters. I can reuse it very easily in Data Factory. And by the way, this will notify me back from the... And actually, super good question. Let me stop this. Let me show you a demo where I break something. I will pause my analysis services. Since it's pausing, my refresh will fail. So if I would run this pipeline to refresh analysis services right now, thanks to using Logic App approach and Logic App returning back me some information, I will now see that my refresh failed. Of course, you can still do that with Data Factory. It's a little bit more trickier to return errors. So in just a couple of seconds, we will see error. So let's see, this copy is about 7 seconds. Boom, we're done. Error appeared. And in the debug, you can open either error message. And in this error message, you will find that there's 404 because the service was not found because it's not running. And you can expand and get some error details. Pretty much, I prefer this approach. Additionally, if you ever stumble upon my GitHub, and I didn't actually plan to show that, but since this is the question, I have this as a template. So for any other project, I can just click this deploy to Azure button, and I'm set. I literally click one stuff, and then in Data Factory, I can use this webhook without coding, so that my other friends, other colleagues do not need to introduce an Azure automation, do not need to learn PowerShell. By the way, surprisingly, not that many people know PowerShell. In my company, it's probably like 5 people, and we have like 1,000 employees. Surprisingly, people would know Python, and by the way, Azure Automation now supports Python, but I don't think there are libraries for AES Refresh. So this is a codeless approach that any data engineer who's not very fluent in PowerShell can use. That's why I prefer this approach. Any other questions? I know we are exactly on time, so I would say let's give it 2-3 minutes. If someone can raise a hand or type in a question, however you feel comfortable, shoot me up. If there will be no questions within those next 3-5 minutes, I will go to our Lingaro stand. I'll be hanging there around for like 10-15 minutes. If someone will have a question, you can hit me up there, or you can write a private message, by the way, /W, right, for whisper. And I can actually turn on my camera now. You can type /W and whisper Adam Marczak, right? So you can type me a private message. Also, if you want to ask something offline, if you feel shy asking this on a forum. So, any more questions, guys? Happy to answer some, but as I really hope that you will get more or less a gist of Logic App versus Data Factory and the scenarios where I typically use Logic Apps. Is there a way to script such a Logic App so it can be kept as a source control and used in a different environment? Yes, exactly. Good question again. I do that. Basically, this is a source control. This template JSON is this exactly Logic App that I used, and it's open source. You can use it and grab it at any time. I even add a deploy PowerShell script. There will be also deploy bash script for Azure CLI. It's not finished yet. It's something new that I created 3 days ago. I even provide you with a full PowerShell script to deploy this to any environment and automatically add this Logic App as Azure Analysis Services Administrator. So literally, this is a plug and play. You run the script, and you're good to go. And this will refresh, permissions are set, everything is done. So yes, you can do that. Any other questions? Happy to answer. I don't see any raised hands. I see some private messages, but I will check those after the presentation. I would assume that private is not about question. Any other questions? I'm happy to answer if you had some issues with Data Factory or Logic Apps when it comes to integrations as well. So you can specify your scenario. Maybe we can figure out something on the spot. And I'm looking here because there's my chat there. Any more questions? If not, we are free past, and I will be already getting off the stage so that my next colleague from Lingaro here will be presenting another session on Databricks Data Lake. So if you want to see advanced transformation, very cool session by our colleague here. So stay on that. If not, guys, for joining. Loved to have you here. Those were our strategic sponsors. Check me out on our Lingaro stand if you want. Thank you again for listening, and have a wonderful day, rest of the session, and stay safe, guys.